PsychoSocialism, where today I'm diving deep into the emotions that we hate the most, because knowledge is power, and people should have more of it. The differences between particular emotions and what we call them are important. Sometimes emotions can feel the same in the moment, but provoke different behaviour or are caused by different experiences. Picking these distinctions apart and understanding why they exist is a key part of psychological research. This is easy when emotions are distinctly opposed to one another, happiness versus sadness, anger versus calm, care versus indifference, but human emotions are naturally more complicated than this. Some of them live opposite each other for sure, but what happens when they are next door neighbours? How does sadness differ from grief? How does fear differ from anxiety? How does guilt differ from shame? That last one is a subject of a lot of scientific discourse to this day. Guilt and shame feel pretty similar in the moment, and they share a lot of features with each other. Basically because they both feel shit. They are both negative emotions, they are both self-conscious emotions, and they both can impact our behaviour in life-altering ways. Now you might think, hey, on the surface they both look like ducks and act like ducks, right? But so do swans and geese, and neither of them are ending up on a pancake with plum sauce. While they feel like the same thing on the surface, the mechanics of how guilt and shame actually work are very different, and these differences are important to our lives in ways we might not expect. But before we talk about why they matter, let's dive in and find out what the differences are. As this is still a topic ripe for scientific discourse, I'm going to make some tricky assertions that have many outliers in different directions, so the words mostly and on average should be hanging around in the air at all times. Guilt is a negative self-conscious emotion. What causes guilt to arise is the action of doing something that violates your internal morals. Examples of this are things like cheating on a significant other without them knowing when you believe in being honest and faithful, having gay sex in a church if you think churches are sacred, driving a gas-guzzling car if you believe that these cars are killing the literal planet. All of these actions directly contradict the beliefs of the person doing them. They are breaking an internal moral code in order to do something that they want to do in the moment. The conflict between these two causes cognitive dissonance, a negative feeling driven by inconsistency between a person's beliefs and a person's actions. The key word there is actions. Guilt focuses on very specific actions and decisions we make, actions and decisions that we feel responsible for and that cause harm. People attempt all sorts of mental gymnastics to justify themselves and avoid responsibility, as we know. But when a person feels specifically guilty about an action they can't avoid responsibility for, there is only one way to reduce the guilt, and that's by fixing it. Guilt generally causes people to become proactive, to attempt to actively fix the problem. If you feel guilty for knocking someone's wall over, you're more likely to pay him to fix it, or try and fix it yourself. You recognise that your decision was destructive and vow quietly never to do it again. This type of example is why a lot of psychological research calls guilt a pro-social emotion, meaning it has a purpose in allowing communities to get on and work together. Which intuitively makes sense, right? A tribe of cave people who feel no guilt stealing from each other is likely going to fall apart pretty quick. In practice, however, sometimes it's not as simple as fixing the wall you broke. What if the damage done was emotional in nature and can't be fixed directly? Take, for example, having an affair. You can't unsleep with them. All you can do is promise to be a better spouse and beg forgiveness, which you may not always get. Some researchers argue that this type of no-win situation often leads to antisocial, self-destructive behaviour. The unfun kind, where people actively punish themselves for what they've done. Sometimes the extreme, no, not like that. So guilt is focused on actions that violate internal morals that you take responsibility for, thus provoking a proactive attempt to fix things. Usually, anyway. Shame, however, is like guilt's little sister who steals her clothes and ID to get into the clubs. Sure, at a passing glance she looks the same, but there's a lot of trickery going on underneath. Shame is a part of the negative, self-conscious family of emotions, but unlike its sister, it has a totally different trigger, focus, and result. Unlike guilt, shame focuses not on what you did, but who you are. You don't have to actively harm anything to experience shame. Shame occurs when someone is reminded that they are inadequate, that who they are is not the ideal version of who they are, and that what they are isn't what they ought to be. Because shame is triggered by the perception of the self being wrong in some way, it differs in that it focuses on the wrongness of your identity, not your actions. This is the central conflict that occurs when you feel ashamed. Not I did wrong, but I am wrong. It is a conflict between what you think you are and what you think you should or could be. Let's say, for example, you identify as a cisgender male, but for one reason or another, you are wearing women's clothing. Do you feel uncomfortable because wearing women's clothing hurts anybody? No, because it doesn't. You haven't broken any internal moral code here. You feel uncomfortable because a cis man shouldn't be wearing this. It's not what a cis man ought to do. Of course, you can rationalise this feeling away pretty easily depending on the circumstances. If you're going to the Rocky Horror Show, it's easy to be okay with wearing a corset because that's what Rocky Horror fans do, right? No discomfort here. But if you don't have those rationalisations, you're going to feel a bit of shame. And if you're actually more comfortable, then maybe your identity isn't what you thought it was, and that's a different discussion altogether. Shame is often referred to as a breaking of external rules and a fear of what other people think. But it's important to note that the external rules about who should be what often become internalised by a process of socialisation, and aren't thought about very much until they're challenged directly. They feel internal, until you really think about where you got them from. Unlike guilt, shame does not usually lead to people making amends. Studies have found that people who feel ashamed tend to withdraw and escape the cause of shame instead. It's a flight response rather than a fight response. This can lead to people becoming hostile to the world around them, defensive about the fact that their ought self doesn't match their current self. Some psychologists refer to shame behaviour as antisocial, not because it makes you start spray tagging stuff, but because it results in feeling alienated from the people you live with. These psychologists are largely correct, except when the shamed person agrees with the external rules themselves, they don't become defensive. They become passive and conform to the rules. The behaviour is not antisocial, but it does seem a little unhealthy for the individual. So let's recap for those of you in the cheap seats. Guilt is what you feel when you do something bad. You did something harmful. You violated your internal moral code. If you accept responsibility for the action, you will try and make amends in any way possible. If you can't, you will find a way to punish yourself somehow. If you don't accept responsibility and dismiss your actions instead, you will likely make the same mistake again one day. Shame is what you feel when you think you are something bad. What you are is not who you want or ought to be. If you don't agree with what people say you ought to be, you are more likely to withdraw from other people to escape that feeling, and you're more likely to be hostile and defensive. If you do agree that what you are is wrong, you will withdraw but be passive and conformist. Okay, yes, we understand the difference now. Good job, mate. You've managed to name some things, but I don't have any guilt or shame weighing me down, so why should I care? Ha ha ha! Because, gentle viewer, these emotions can still be used to control you. In the UK, where I am forced to live due to an ancient curse bestowed upon my family by William the Conqueror, 3.8 million adults aged 18 to 74 experienced emotional abuse before the age of 16. Of those, around 75% experienced other forms of abuse as well, including neglect, physical or sexual. On average, survivors of domestic abuse waited 2.3 years to seek help, and that's the high-risk category. The medium-risk group took closer to 3 years. It's also worth noting that this data comes from the pre-COVID era. During the lockdowns, domestic abuse has only climbed in a rather sickening way. These stats are alarming, for sure, but what do they have to do with guilt and shame? Should we feel guilty for not doing more? Should we feel ashamed that our country is like this? Yes. But what I really want to know looking at these stats is why? If people are in high-risk situations, why do they wait 2.3 years before seeking help? Well, at least one of the reasons is due to guilt. Gaslighting is defined as a manipulation tactic that aims to make the target start doubting their own memory, perception, or judgment. By speaking confidently, aggressively, or emotionally, a person can manipulate another into believing their memories of events and situations are incorrect. A top-notch gaslighter will often rearrange the story into something that shows them as being in the right, whilst you were in the wrong. You are guilty. You should take responsibility. In fact, the fact you haven't yet makes you even more guilty, and you never considered my feelings at all, did you? Just like you didn't consider it when you went and hung out with that bitch. And I don't care that she's your friend. She's a dangerous, home-wrecking Gaslighting is essentially a way for abusers and bullies to displace their guilt onto the victims of their actions. The reason it works so well is because not only does it blame the victim, it changes the story entirely to prove to them that not only did they do a bad thing, they are responsible for the bad thing that they did. Now, someone who's used to spotting this kind of thing might not be hoodwinked by it, but if the gaslight works and the target accepts responsibility for what happened, it triggers the natural responses of guilt. I'm sorry. I was wrong. Please, how can I make it up to you? This response affirms the abuser's need for control and gives them that feeling of security back. It may even calm them down for a while, but it will also allow them to dictate how the target makes amends on their terms. In an abusive relationship, this also acts as operant conditioning, by punishing the victim for speaking against the abuser and using fear of conflict as negative reinforcement. So why do people stay in abusive relationships? Or not notice they're abusive in the first place? Well, one reason is guilt. They feel like they have to make amends to their partner for something that they did wrong. for something that triggered them, even when it's not true, because true or not, once you have accepted responsibility, you feel guilty, and that drives you to either make amends or make yourself feel miserable as punishment. It's worth noting this dynamic is not unique to personal, sexual relationships either. It can happen between parent and child, teacher and student, authority figure and non-authority figure. One could argue that all hierarchical relationships have some element of guilt in them, but that's a topic for another time. But now that we know how our guilt can be used against us, how about shame? Unlike guilt, which is usually targeted to a specific behaviour or event, shaming is an attack on our identity itself, usually in the context of not conforming to a socially constructed idea of what we should be. Any difference from the norm that society has established can be used as a way of making you feel ashamed. If you're shorter than average, you're a midget. If you're taller than average, you're lanky. If you're too big, you're a fatty. If you're too small, you're a twig. If you're gay or bi, you're a degenerate. If you're a straight boy that looks feminine, you're obviously gay. If you're a straight girl but you look a little bit butch, lesbo. If you're trans, well, fuck, they've got a whole lexicon of ways to try and make you feel shit. Just tell them to fuck off. Shame is triggered by the feeling that your current self does not match your ideal self or who you think you should be. The parent, partner or schoolyard bully that is trying to point out both that difference and at the same time change your concept of your ideal self into something that matches theirs, widening the difference that induces the shame in the first place. This is why shaming feels so much worse for children and teens, because they haven't had time to create an ideal self, the person that they should be, let alone work out who they actually are and to stand next to it. The perpetrators of shame often don't realise they're doing this, of course. What they want is the behaviour that shame leads to: passivity, withdrawal, conformity. Sadly, the best example of this concerns a very dark topic indeed: eating disorders. In 2012, a study was conducted looking into the lives of teenage girls who engage heavily in gymnastics, dance or other aesthetic sports, and who developed eating disorders. They found that the amount of body shaming these girls went through, both from their peers, from their coaches, parents, caused a shift in the ideal self, tying it to their body shape and how much they weighed. The shame they feel from being different from the ideal dancer or the ideal gymnast pushes them to accept what people say about them and conform to an ideal self that is more often than not completely impossible. It pushes them to eat less and work harder, try and extinguish the shame by chasing the impossible vision of what they should be. After years of shaming about weight and body type, actively encouraged by the adults and peers that they respect, is it any wonder that these girls stopped eating? This is a very specific example of how shaming can affect your behaviour, but there are countless examples to consider in wider society. Why do boys fear playing with Barbies? Shame. Why do us LGBT folks stay in the closet so long? Shame. Why do we worry about our parents seeing our internet history? Shame. The presence of shame, or the fear of being shamed by others, can have hugely negative effects on self-esteem and well-being. And if you think, I would never change my behaviour out of fear of what other people think, chances are in some way you already have. Sometimes changes for the best, like not taking your junk out in public or at parties. Had to learn that one the hard, but the changes are based, in part, on other people's values and ideals. That's not always a good thing. Both guilt and shame are emotions that evolved to keep small groups of humans together and keep them functional. Guilt makes people address mistakes and apologise. Shame makes people conform so that the tribe can focus on the tasks at hand. Like so many emotions, however, what worked back then in small groups doesn't apply to... Did you know we live in a society? It makes you think. It might make you think, if guilt is caused by a breach of our own internal morals, and shame is caused by us not living up to our ideal self, what does living in a society have to do with that? The answer is more than you think. Contrary to some beliefs, our morals and ideal self are not innate metaphysical constructs that are unique to our biology. They are learned, not just from books or entertaining, educational YouTube videos. We learn a lot from the process of socialization, a process which is itself guided by society and its rules, including what our morals are and what our ideal self is. There is a lot of research out there looking into the differences between Western cultures, such as the US, and Eastern cultures, such as China or India. One of the most common differences being that Westerners tend to value the individual more than the group, whereas in the East, the group takes priority over the individual. This is where the tired trope of comes from. See, even the most tired cliches have a root somewhere. This difference in cultural ideas can be seen most clearly in how we treat pop stars. Whilst in the West, we pore over their personal lives of famous singers in grubby detail and prop them up as individual stars, In the East, idol bands are publicly and professionally shamed for having a personal life at all, with the idea being it detracts from the group's appeal to fans and should be discouraged, which, now that I'm reading it out, is kind of unsettling and probably deserves unpacking by itself. Moral codes and ideal selves are shaped by the culture we live in. In the West, we expect everyone to support themselves and we feel shame accepting help, thinking it's selfish, whereas in the East, it's more expected that you'll prioritise the group or family first, and going it alone is considered selfish. It's worth pointing out that this is a scale, not a binary, and indeed the scale is very large and made of lots and lots of averages. The East-West divide is the most prominent, but these divides happen within countries and between countries as well, so it might be worth thinking, is any part of your morals or ideal self affected by what your culture expects from you? We live, after all, in a society. So now that we know how guilt and or shame can affect our thinking, what can we do about it? Well, this isn't a self-help channel, and I don't know enough about your life to judge whether or not you should feel guilty or ashamed for anything. Guilt, shame, and, well, every other emotion for that matter, are a part of us, and they exist to tell us about the world we live in. Guilt lets you know when you've fucked up, shame lets you know where you don't belong. To try and suppress these feelings without confronting them is not only impossible in the long term, it's downright unhealthy. The goal of all self-conscious beings should not be to ignore our feelings, but to reflect on them. Why do I feel guilty? What did I do wrong? Should I feel guilty? How much was really within my control? Why do I feel ashamed? Who do I think I am? Who do I want to be? What do other people think I should be? Why don't they like what I am? Who's right? These are difficult questions. Even if they seem easy on paper, I don't have all the answers obviously, only you can find those, with honest reflection and fearless self-examination. Guilt and shame are powerful forces that can drive us to extreme behaviours, not always healthy or adaptive ones either. So before you let them drive you, remember that while you can't control how you feel, you can control what you do about it. And next time you're feeling guilty for breaking a plate or your boss sneers at you for the way you look, think for a moment, why does he want me to feel ashamed? Then smile and watch the process work inside your head. Like any process in society, question it and work out for yourself what you want to do. Hi everybody, thanks for making it to the end of number 3. Double thanks to all of you out there who've been giving me useful feedback, much appreciated. If you've got any questions or something to say, please leave it in the comments. I'd love to hear any suggestions for new topics. I've got some ideas, but I'd like to know what you think. Okay, hope you all enjoyed it. I better get started on the next one. See you soon.